I'm not sure how to follow that, really. I'm gonna talk about difficult stuff that holds us all back. So I suppose maybe I'm the yang to David's yin, or maybe the yin to his yang. Innovation is going to come into it, but I'm also going to talk about the challenges that we see that organizations are facing. But crucially, what I'm going to try and explain or highlight is how data is really central to us all. It's not the only thing that matters, but it's really central to how we start to think differently and how we start to build more innovative, more sustainable, more resilient organizations. All right, if you excuse me a sec, I'm just going to get some water. So yeah, my name is Neil. I work for IDC. Very kind of you to say that Gartner is not the only analyst firm around. That's very kind of you. I like to say we're like Gartner, but nicer. So if there's anyone here from Gartner, we can have a little fist fight afterwards. All right. So let's talk about how data is the new oxygen. I'm going to start off with some slightly depressing stories, but I think they'll be familiar probably to many of you in your organizations. So we've been over the last year, we've been collecting CEO interviews. Firms like ours, we count things. We talk to people, we try and learn what's going on. But very often, it's easy for us to get stuck just talking to technology people. And we wanted to be very intentional to get out of that box and to hear what's on CEOs' minds. Because ultimately, of course, they really matter. They drive a lot of the agenda. And as a slight aside, one of the things we see more and more and more is that technology investment is not really being driven by the IT department, or at least not exclusively. The C-suite is increasingly influential, not just in terms of providing budget, but actually in driving direction. So we see more and more collaboration across the whole C-suite. It's not just about what happens in tech departments that matters. And so learning about what CEOs want and what they're scared of and what they're trying to achieve is really, really important. Yeah, this kind of stuff happens quite a lot in our interviews. Here's another one, which may be familiar to some of you if you're in supply chain functions or if you're in logistics and so on. This is typical kind of reaction we get from when we do our CEO interviews. Times are tough. Organizations are really struggling. So yes, there's all that innovation out there, absolutely. And I would not try and dissuade anybody from trying to learn about what new technology can do and trying to understand how to break through, create new market opportunities with new technology. But equally, many businesses are struggling. And we talk about the winds of change, which is a somewhat poetic way of saying that organizations are buffeted from all directions. There's headwinds, whether that's the Russia-Ukraine war, whether that's inflation, whether that's for some organizations Brexit related. Those things, of course, create headwinds for organizations. There's crosswinds, things like changing regulatory environments, changing competition, new startups, fintechs, health techs, those kinds of organizations. And there's also tailwinds, like, for example, the increasing digitization of companies that creates new opportunities for us to accelerate, to be more efficient, to be more customer focused. Every organization is different and experiences these wins differently. What may be a headwind for one might actually be a tailwind for another. But what we are seeing is that more and more these are becoming interconnected and they're feeding off each other. And this does create real challenges for organizations. So just recently, again, we built on all these CEO interviews and we did a whole bunch of survey work. And we asked CEOs, what are the main things that they're actually troubled by at the moment? And you can see a list of the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Changing environmental targets and regulations, inflationary pressure, supply chain disruptions, cybersecurity threats, poor COVID vaccination rates and or new variants, talent skills gap, political risks and government interventions. None of them are directly, well, cybersecurity threats, none of them are sort of core tech issues, but tech is shaped by all of these things. Tech investment landscape is shaped by all of these things. And the numbers, and I apologize for them, they should have been appearing, and they just appeared. These numbers are, we just recently did a survey of senior IT people, and this is some of the percentages. So we asked them, what are the top things that you're also worried about at the moment? What are you focused on? And you can see that, significant proportions of the CIO population in Europe, and this was blue chip organizations, that meant these are kind of 10,000 plus employee organizations, really are struggling with, okay, how do we deal with inflation? What do we do about our IT expenditure, but also how do we use IT to help the business deal with margin pressure, to deal with the challenges that inflation brings? Supply chain disruptions, and I know that's going to be on the agenda later as well. Cybersecurity threats. Cybersecurity is pretty much always number one at the top of any survey we do when we ask IT executives, what are the main things you're investing in or worrying about right now? You can pretty much always bet that cybersecurity is number one. And lastly, talent skills gap. We know that this is almost universal, and if anybody is in an organization where they don't currently struggle with getting hold of talent to help them with technology delivery, I would love to meet you afterwards and tell me how you're doing it. Because organization after organization after organization, whether we're talking about data management, analytics, cloud computing, software development, integration, automation, AI, any of these more kind of like front foot type investments, the number one barrier that people tell us they have is we can't get enough of the right people into our organization to help us move as fast as we want. It's an absolutely colossal issue. It is actually slightly more of an issue in smaller markets. So if you go to Portugal or Norway or let's say Belgium, for example, or Italy, it's slightly more of a challenge than it might be in the UK or France or Germany, but it is a problem everywhere. But as this gentleman from INCM, which is the Portuguese Mint and Official Printing Office, we particularly loved his quote, which is that what's going on is not just one crisis, it's kind of like an omni crisis, right? There's a lot of stuff all happening at once. And the key is not about moving in any one particular direction, because so much of what's happening is unpredictable. There's that term, isn't there? I don't know if you've heard, VUCA, which is all about volatility, uncertainty, and so on. We live in an environment which is very volatile, very uncertain. And so the only answer is that we just have to be prepared for anything. We have to be better at sensing, better at responding, better at taking action. And technology is absolutely critical to doing that. So, when we asked that same CIO group, what kinds of technology investments are you prioritizing in order to help you become more agile, better at sensing, better at responding, better at taking action? And I've just highlighted, I don't know how well you can see it at the back, I apologize if some of the fonts are a little small. I've highlighted in darker blue the two largest bars, which are big data and analytics and AI and machine learning. So those were the things most commonly cited as technologies that organizations were investing in to become better at sensing, better at responding, better at taking action. And that's good, because something we know from yet more of our research, we do a lot of research, we talk to a lot of people, we run a lot of surveys, we speak to a lot of people at our own events and in customer consulting sessions and so on. One of the things we've been doing is creating this thing called the Enterprise Intelligence Index, which is kind of grandiose sounding thing. It's basically a way of benchmarking organizations according to how effective they are at using data to drive their business. So this thing, the Enterprise Intelligence Index, tries to benchmark this by looking at a couple of different factors. Number one, how good is your organization at accessing, collecting, integrating, and managing data from a whole variety of different sources, all kinds of different data sources, not just structured data in your relational databases, but a whole variety of sources, both internal and external to your organization. How good are you at doing all of that collecting and amassing and managing? Can you do that at scale? Can you do it reliably? And can you do it securely? That's number one. Number two, how good are you at taking that data and creating insights that really matter and delivering those insights to the point where they're actually useful? So not just to create reports or dashboards, but also to directly drive decision-making, to drive decisions and recommendations into business process workflows, into applications, into the customer experience, into your products and services. So that's the second one. That's about delivering insights at scale into where they really matter, across venues, across channels, across environments. And the third thing is, how good are you at using all that experience to help you get better, to create a continuous learning cycle? So the way we build this enterprise intelligence benchmark is by looking at those three factors. How good are you at bringing data together from lots of different places, managing it properly, governing it? How good are you at taking that data and turning it into insights and delivering those into the places that matter? And how good are you at learning and improving based on your experience of all that stuff? And sorry for the big setup, but the payoff is that it turns out that this really matters. So what we've done is, by benchmarking organizations on this basis and then looking at their financial results and other kinds of business outcomes, we find across a whole range of factors, the companies that do all of that well perform a lot better than those that don't. So there's a clear correlation between maturity in this idea of enterprise intelligence and business performance. So when we look at top quartile performers, so that's around about 22-23% of organizations are what we would call the top quartile performers. They experience 2.7 times, they're 2.7 times more likely to experience strong revenue growth. That was more than, I think, 15% 2 years running than everybody else. And they're 3.6 times more likely to report that they are getting to market with new customer experiences, new products, new services, new propositions faster than anybody else. So this really does matter. It's not just about, hey, let's collect a load of data and then everything's great. When you collect data, when you deliver those insights that matter, when you continuously learn, when you do all that effectively at scale, securely, reliably, and in the right environment, and I'll come back to that in a minute because that turns out to be really important, in the right environment, you can make a massive difference to your organization. All right. But this presentation was called Data is the New Oxygen. I haven't really talked about data yet. One of the other things we count, or one of the other things we try to size, is data. How much data is being created? How much data is being consumed? So we have this project. It's been going for about 8 years now, I think. It's called the IDC Global Data Sphere. And we use a whole bunch of sources of information to try and figure out how much data there is and what kind of data it is, where it lives, how it's being used, and so on. And the analysts that are working on this project estimate, of course we can only estimate, 81 zettabytes of data was created last year. So that's not the data that exists, that's just the data that was created. 81 zettabytes. I probably don't need to tell you that is a lot of data. Over half of it was created by enterprises, not by consumers. Around 2/3 was distributed on endpoints and edge platforms. We often like to talk, don't we, about how everything is moving to the cloud. And yes, there is absolutely a trend in that direction. But right now, we still have a lot of data being created, not in cloud environments, being created in other places. But I also want to draw your attention to this bit in the corner. 19% of it is real-time data, and that's the bit that's growing really quickly. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So, there's a lot of data. how you use data really matters. It makes a difference to your business. I've just shown you what that's all about. But I have a bit of a problem, which is this idea that data is the new oil. How many of you have heard that? I'm betting most of you have come across, thanks, one hand. I'm betting that most of you have come across this idea that data is the new oil. But I have a real problem with this analogy, because actually I believe it fundamentally misrepresents what data is and what its value is to you and to your customers. Because when we think about oil, it's in the ground, so it's kind of like dead dinosaurs and stuff, and we suck it up through big tubes, and then it goes somewhere and it gets turned into things. We can fuel things with it, we can turn it into plastic and create products and so on. But essentially it's a one direction, it's a unidirectional kind of thing. Dead dinosaurs, pipes, products, and then actually we have a lot of problems. Externalities, economists like to call them. We have a lot of problems that we then have to deal with, right? Because there's no cycle there, really. It's unidirectional. And that is a bit of a problem, because that's not how data actually works in modern organizations. That's not where data's real value lies. And I would like to put to you that actually data is not the new oil. It's, in fact, much more like oxygen. The reason I've shown a tree here is that trees are very cool things. They're very cool for lots of reasons. Have you ever, this is completely off the cuff, by the way, have any of you ever listened to a tree? I implore you to try it one time when you've got a bit of time on your hands, particularly March or April, a hardwood tree, so a deciduous tree, not an evergreen. If you find the right tree at the right time, and you can look up on a search engine what the best kind of tree is and the best kind of place, you can hear the tree. You can hear sap running through the tree. It sounds like a rushing river. It's the most insane and beautiful thing you will ever experience, I think. Anyway, trees are fantastic because they create oxygen. They are part of a perpetual cycle. Yeah, with animals, we consume oxygen, we create carbon dioxide. Trees take in carbon dioxide, create oxygen. They are part of, and they really drive this perpetual cycle of oxygen consumption, creation, and we could not survive without this kind of rich ecosystem, which trees are a massive part. Data is like oxygen because actually it's not just sucked up from the ground and turned into something and then doesn't become useful anymore. It is part, data creates a continuous cycle. And I'll talk a bit more about what that means over the next couple of slides. I said about this 81 zettabytes of data. What's in it? Well, we all know about this stuff, right? Business records, records about customers, products, financials, suppliers, that kind of stuff. Transactions, immutable data about what's happened in the business in the past, log files, that kind of stuff. Historical aggregates we might use for analytics. We all know about that. We also, of course, have a lot of content, and increasingly that's not just written things like Word documents or PDFs or scans. It's also video, audio, those kinds of things. And increasingly, historically, of course, that was managed completely separately. Most of the time, organizations just put it somewhere and tried to make sure that people didn't steal the stuff they shouldn't steal. And they put a whole load of controls around it to make sure nobody went to jail and kind of forgot about it. But increasingly, as organizations are trying to automate more and more aspects of routine work, it turns out that the data inside those documents and the metadata about those documents is really, really important in increasing the scope of automation that we can address. Just think about how most organizations process invoices, for example. You can do a lot of automated invoice processing at the back end, but if you can actually automatically ingest an invoice, which may be human readable but not computer readable, but if you can automatically, using AI, understand, classify, and extract all of the relevant data from that invoice and then inject that into an automation engine that then automates the processing, you haven't just automated the back end of managing that invoice, you've automated the front end too. So more and more we see organizations starting to think about this stuff not just as records that we manage from primarily a kind of privacy, security, and governance perspective, but real things that have value right now. And we're bringing these two worlds together. But I talked about real-time data and how that's the bit that's maybe most interesting. And this data is all about behavior. It's all about behavior. It's about app behavior. It's about infrastructure behavior, business processes, data pipelines, customer journeys, and so on and so on and so on. This bit is particularly important because it is at the heart of the idea of data as oxygen. It's at the heart of this idea of creating continuous cycles of insight and action, learning and improvement. And let's explore a bit more of what's going on there. So if you look, when you look out at the market and you look at what's happening in terms of instrumentation, observability, all of these things are connected. Often we don't connect the dots, but all of this stuff is happening all at once. So increasingly, we can understand what's happening in our infrastructure. We can use IoT technology, right, to gather events, get continuous real-time data from vehicles, from plant, from machinery, from infrastructure, and so on. And companies like IBM, Software AG, Science Logic are great at doing that. Business processes, increasingly, when our processes, our admin and operational processes flow through things like SAP, IFS technology, other enterprise app vendors technology, Salesforce, ServiceNow, anything you like. The log files that get created as transactions flow through those things can be mined, and we can start to create near real-time pictures of how work is flowing through our business processes. And vendors like Abby and Celonis, that's what they do. Data pipelines, so taking data from the source systems, managing the quality, preparing it, integrating, moving it around, transforming it, loading it into warehouses and so on. That's pipeline technology. And increasingly, that is also being observed and monitored, instrumented. StreamSets, Fivetran, many other vendors also do that. Customer journeys, as customers' journeys become more and more digital, more and more online, we can actually track customers as they move from mobile to website, from call center, and so on and so on. We can understand how customers are moving through our organizations, where they're experiencing positive situations, where they're maybe having trouble. We can start to build pictures of how they move through their interactions with our organization. And Adobe and others do that very well. User behavior. Inside our organizations, we can track, very often anonymized for very good reasons, but we can track the behavior of users in our organizations, and we can see when they might be exhibiting behaviors that might be suggestive, for example, of some kind of security breach. Or we can track and see how effective they're being, which are the highest performing teams. What do they do differently from other people? And so on and so on and so on. We can even, and David mentioned space earlier. This might seem a little bit far-fetched, but even there's organizations like Orbital Insight. Microsoft is also doing this now, taking the huge proliferation in small satellite systems, like the massive networks of very small satellites, and the geospatial and video and imagery that they create, merging that with geofencing, geospatial data and AI to give organizations insights into global supply chain movements, for example, to the health of ecosystems. You can use satellites, you can use Orbital Insight and Microsoft and other vendors' technology to look at the car parks from your competitors' retail stores to see how well different stores are doing. For example, you can monitor shipping traffic. You can look at how many containers are moving around. You can use that kind of data to get really interesting insights about the ecosystem. And more organizations are doing that because the cost is dropping very, very fast. So we're moving to a situation where everything is instrumentable, not necessarily instrumented, because that's up to you, but instrumentable. And what's really going on here, as I said, is that we are shifting the way we think about data. We're moving from a situation which was a bit more like the oil metaphor, which was really dominant 10, 20, 30 years ago. You get data from your running processes, from your people. You use that data, you push it up to create reports and dashboards, and you give it to the management. They look at it every month or every quarter. They think about it. They make some decisions. They then implement, they then highlight some directives. Okay, we need to go create a new product. We need to change a process. We need to grow this team. And then eventually that filters down through the organization and some change happens, maybe. That's how we used to do it. But like I said, we're really changing. Organizations, because of digital transformation, are changing the ways that data gets used, and they're changing the ways that data delivers value. They may not know it, but this is what's happening. We're shifting from the left to the right. And all that behavioral data is really what's driving this change. So it's not just about sucking data out of the ground, giving it to leaders, asking leaders to interpret it, and then push instructions back down through the organization. It's about using data to create that continuous, virtuous cycle of insight and action. The more we digitize, as we digitize processes, customer experiences, decisions, products, services, as all of that gets digitized, it all creates data. Because digitizing isn't just about automating things, it's also about those things giving you data. Yeah? When you digitize something, you make it transparent. It creates data that you can use. So the more we digitize, the more data we get. All of that behavioral data starts to flow. And the more we digitize things, apologies, that something weird happened to the color there. That, on that top right, that says decisions. The more we digitize those processes, decisions, services, products, and experiences, those things also become destinations for insight. Because it's not just about creating reports and dashboards anymore. Like I said, it's about creating predictions and recommendations that get driven right into the flow of decision-making, right into the flow of work. They get pushed into digital products and services and customer experiences. So again, it's about creating this continuous, virtuous cycle. And what we're seeing is that if your organization is thinking about AI, if it's thinking about automation, if it's thinking about analytics, none of that is going to succeed without solid foundation. Solid foundation for how you collect, ingest, integrate, and then manage at scale, securely, and in a governed way, the data that is at the heart of this virtuous cycle. None of that happens because all of these markets feed off each other and they all drive each other. And data is at the absolute heart of everything. All right, so I talked, I've got about 10 minutes left. I talked a few minutes ago about the right environment. When I was talking about that Enterprise Intelligence Index, you remember I talked about being able to collect and gather information together. I talked about being able to drive those insights out at scale into all the venues that matter, whether that's decisions, products, services, experiences, those kinds of things. And I talked about learning using that data, using that insight, using that experience. And I said that that only really works in the right environment. And so in the last few minutes, I want to talk about what that environment is. And it's all based around a simple idea, which is trust. And many organizations, when they start to embrace the idea that data can be at the heart of transformation, heart of new business models, new products and services and so on, they will talk about data culture, or they might talk about data literacy. And that's absolutely crucial, but it's really important to kind of pick that apart and realize that those things aren't just about training people to understand how to use an analytics package or a visualization tool. There's much deeper things going on, and those deeper things are all about trust. So we think that there are there's a sort of stack of four main things that organizations need to get right. And as you might expect with IDC, we've done a whole bunch of research, a whole bunch of case study work to try and figure out what's going on here. And what we've come up with is that there are these four levels at which we need to think about trust. If we want to deliver real data-driven innovation, data-driven business, we need to think about these four levels. Platforms, pipelines, tools and analytics, and culture. So we need data platforms. Like I said, they're at the foundation of everything. We need those to be stable and integrated. We need them to be able to abstract away from the details of underlying data sources and help us manage data effectively at scale, securely, and they need to be flexible. We need to be able to then take that data, move it to the right place. We need to be able to increasingly do that automatically because time is of the essence. More and more of what we're trying to do is near real-time insight, driving predictions and recommendations, all those kinds of things. We need to be able to move at pace. We need to be able to experiment at pace. So more and more we see organizations trying to automate the way that data gets moved around. That's where the pipelines come into play. Tools and analytics, I think we all know what that is. That's about creating insights from data. And culture, which is about the universal awareness of what data really is, what its value is, and importantly, an understanding of why it should be used and how it can be used appropriately. All of these things matter. You can't just focus on one and expect success. It's also true that you can't really do any of this just by starting at the bottom and working upwards. You need to think about stakeholder engagement at every level. And the reason is that in most organizations, certainly medium to large and very large organizations, there is no one person who owns all of those outcomes. All of the capabilities that we need to think about, in very many cases, they're actually owned or there's different people who are responsible for the outcomes at those four levels. And we need to find ways to get all of those people aligned. It's not just a matter of using the tech. We have to find ways to get all those people aligned. And that's another reason why trust is so important. Starting at the top is also really important. We can do lots of great stuff down in the weeds with the platform, with the pipelines, but unless we actually start by thinking about what is it the C-suite wants, what are they trying to achieve with data and insight, how can we gather data and insight to help them achieve those things, unless we start top down, it turns out to be a really, really difficult thing to deliver. Because what we see is that there's a real spread at the moment of, let's say, sentiment from senior executives about the potential of using data to drive innovation, data to drive new business capabilities. There's a real variability. We're lucky to see that there's around a third that are enthusiastic about the potential of using data to create new outcomes. But there's 2/3 who are, let's say, less than enthusiastic. And unless we get their buy-in, we ain't going nowhere. Because in 55% of companies, if you're responsible for trying to drive some of this stuff, you report to the CEO. You're going to need their buy-in. You're going to need their understanding. You're going to need their passion to make this work. So we need to engage at the top and have those people at the top try and drive engagement down through the layers. And then let's briefly talk about trust. We need to build capabilities that have trust baked into them at every level. So often when you talk to people about trust in the context of data analytics, people will focus on the infrastructure. They'll talk about security and privacy and anonymization and that kind of stuff. And that's absolutely crucial. It's really, really important. But it's not the only thing you need to focus on. So this is a kind of a brief canter through the outcomes we need to deliver at each level. At the bottom, we need platforms that give us trust, that data is protected, complete, and up to date. That's the job of the platforms from a trust perspective. We need technologies that move data, integrate data, prepare data, and so on, we need them to give us trust that the data we're going to use in our tools and analytics, that we trust that that data is accurate, consistent, and relevant to the decisions and the analytics we want to use to drive the business forward. When it comes to the analytics and the tools we're going to use to help up with our decision making, we need trust that those analytics and those decisions are appropriate, because it's not always appropriate to use certain data to make certain kinds of decisions. In your organizations, particularly if you're in healthcare, but also in many other industries as well, there's a lot of data we have to be very, very careful about using. And some data we absolutely should not use to make certain kinds of decisions. So we have to be very careful about understanding that we're using data in appropriate ways. That isn't going to get us into trouble. And lastly, up at the top, we need a culture and we need a literacy program that enables us to trust that people understand data and they know how to work with it responsibly. So trust is not just about the platform foundation. When we build those layers of capability, trust has to be delivered as part of the outcome all the way up the chain. And that's what really matters. Here's just a quick example of 4 organizations we've researched. We've done really in-depth interviewing with around how they have managed to go on this journey to data-driven transformation, data-driven innovation. So VodafoneZiggo, as you might expect with the name, it's a subsidiary of Vodafone. I think it's in Austria. It's a sort of medium-sized telco. One of the really interesting insights that came from their case study when we looked at what they were doing with data and they were using that to transform was that the people driving the program said, for us, the real success was about, we had to stop thinking like technology managers and technology leaders and start thinking like marketing people. Because we were finding that we were making some successful use cases here and here and here, but we had to find a way to sell those to the rest of the business because we were starting to deliver value, but the real acceleration from our business was only going to come if demand started to come spontaneously from other parts of the business. We had to find ways to go out and explain to the business what we could do and how. And they had to completely change their mindset. And when it really started to come together for them was when they started to use some marketing strategies to really tell their story and to show how they could change the business. I'm also going to highlight Engie here. Really, really interesting, big energy and utilities conglomerate working across Europe, based in France. They had this huge challenge, really, really siloed organization, grown through, how many times have we heard these stories? Massive organization, grown through acquisition, loads and loads and loads of silos of data and capability and process and people. Nobody knew what the heck was going on. Everybody had their own data, just managed their own data. They weren't getting economy of scale. They weren't getting any new insight. They wanted to try and really integrate the business to learn how they could improve the business consistently across all their different geos and business lines. They were also dealing with huge regulatory and technological change because a lot of what they do is electricity distribution. So they were moving from the old grid model where you just generate, push energy through the grid and it gets consumed, to, in some markets, very, very dynamic new modern systems where where electricity would get generated from little local biogenerator units, for example. So they had to create a completely new infrastructure for how they manage data, for how they got insight and tried to predict data demand, energy demand, energy consumption, completely new models for how they did all this. And they knew that their system was not going to work. And they created this idea of a data commonwealth, which is a really profound idea, actually. So the idea of a commonwealth was essentially a common asset that everybody had access to, everybody had responsibility for, and everybody could get value from. So in IT, they created the platform, this very, very cool data lakehouse with a bunch of tools. But individual businesses owned the data and owned the outcomes around that data. They essentially went to that data as a product mindset. Individual businesses brought their data to the platform, worked with the core team to get that data in the right shape, to create processes around it, to help govern it and so on. And they created this ownership model where IT owned the platform, but business owned the data and really understood the responsibilities of owning the data. And they created this vibrant sharing ecosystem, which has enabled them to do incredible things. I'm pretty much out of time. I'm going to leave you with 3 very quick observations. Number 1, uncertainty is everywhere. I think you probably are all experiencing that. To survive and thrive, you have to be able to anticipate, react, and adapt quickly and effectively. It's not just about resilience, though. It's also about innovation. It's about resiliency, agility, efficiency, and innovation all at once. We can't just do one of those things. We have to do it all. But being able to effectively gather, manage, govern, secure, scale the way we deal with data is at the heart of all of those things. And lastly, trust has to be absolutely the core of how you transform. You can't just do this with technology.